Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Before we dive into the video, I want to apologize for not uploading last time. I was on vacation with my family for the past 2 weeks, and I honestly thought I could keep up with the schedule. But with small kids, I realized I wasn't giving them the time they deserved. But now I'm back and ready to bring you more stories. In this video, we're exploring disturbing stories from Appalachia that, in my opinion, are absolutely chilling. From someone who stopped being themselves after encountering something in the woods to a cult that roamed the Appalachians. Whether it still does, no one knows. We've got a bit of everything. As always, thank you so much for being here and for keeping this channel alive. Your support means more than you could ever imagine. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. It's been more than 25 years since this happened, and I've never spoken publicly about it until now. The only reason I'm telling it is because I recently reached out to the family, and they gave me permission under one condition: that I keep everyone's real names private. So, all the names I'll use here are made up, except mine. I know that might sound frustrating, but people's privacy matters. And when a family says no, that has to be respected. Anyway, my name is real, and I'm Mateo. Back in the mid-90s, I was part of a small group of friends who got together because of one thing we all loved: hiking and camping in the mountains. We weren't childhood friends, and outside of those trips, we didn't know each other very deeply, but the trails brought us together. Over time, we developed a kind of routine: pick a weekend, load up our gear, and push ourselves a little farther into the backcountry. In early August of 1995, we planned a long weekend in the Smoky Mountains. The days were hot and heavy with humidity, but the nights cooled just enough to make sleeping in a tent bearable. Our group was 5 in total: myself, a guy I'll call Eric, 2 women I'll call Lisa and Hannah, and another man I'll call Ryan. We weren't professionals, just a handful of adults with decent gear, some maps, and a tendency to bite off more than we should. Looking back, what stands out, to me, is that most of us were loners in our everyday lives. A couple of them had relationships or close friends. But for the most part, the trail was the only real connection any of us had to each other. And after what happened on that trip, I never spoke to any of them again. I think we all made the same silent choice: to forget, or at least to pretend nothing had happened. The first 2 days went smoothly. Almost too smoothly. We covered close to 20 miles and set up camp near a ridge that opened up to endless miles of forest below. It was stunning. Honestly, one of the most beautiful places I've ever stood. That Saturday afternoon, Ryan mentioned he wanted to check out a side trail he'd noticed earlier in the day. It didn't surprise any of us. He was always the restless one, drifting a little farther than the rest. Always curious. We reminded him not to go too far and agreed to meet back at camp before dark. But the minutes kept passing. Then an hour. Then 2. And he still hadn't come back. That's when the stress started creeping in. There had been one other time, months earlier, when we were out on a section of the Pacific Crest Trail. He'd taken about 3 hours longer than expected, but back then it was still broad daylight. And eventually he came striding into camp like nothing had happened. This time was different. The sun was dropping fast, shadows were filling the trees, and the whole group was getting tense. At first we weren't panicked, just uneasy, constantly scanning the tree line. Like I said, Ryan had wandered off before, and usually he'd come back later, full of stories about some overlook or hidden stream he'd stumbled across. Most of the time, we'd laugh at his excitement. But when the darkness settled in and there was still no sign of him, that unease started turning into real fear. We spent the whole night awake, debating what to do. Looking back, I know we should have called for help sooner. But the hours kept slipping by and we couldn't make a clear decision as a group. By the next morning, though, we knew we were in trouble. And we couldn't delay anymore. We split into pairs and combed the nearby trails, shouting his name until our throats were raw. At that point, we were convinced he must have tripped, maybe twisted an ankle or broken a leg, and that's why he wasn't coming back. But no matter how much we called, there was nothing. The forest stayed silent. Too silent. Maybe it was because our own voices were echoing through it, or maybe it was something else entirely. By the second night without him, we finally had no choice but to contact the park rangers. Yes, it was too late, and I know now it was the wrong call to wait. But at the time, we were convinced he was just going to show up, same as always. We made the wrong decision, but under that kind of stress, it was the only one we were capable of making. The official search began the following day. Helicopters circled, dogs combed the woods, and dozens of trained search and rescue volunteers fanned out across the mountainside. We stuck close to the base camp, feeling useless and guilty. On the fourth day, the call finally came through the radios. They'd found him. He was alive, and, in the exact words of the rescuer who reported it, surprisingly well. Hearing that sent a wave of pure relief through all of us, a mix of adrenaline and gratitude that left my hands shaking. We had pictured him dehydrated, scratched up, maybe limping along with the help of the rescue team, but at least alive. Normally, the protocol would have been to take him straight to a hospital, run tests, and get him properly rehydrated. But he insisted on coming back to our camp first. When they finally let him in, I remember just staring at him, struggling to process what I was seeing. It looked like Ryan, at least his face did. But there was something bizarre about him that I couldn't put my finger on at the time. We were all frozen, staring, and even the rescue team seemed a little unsettled. When I stepped closer, there was no doubt it was him. Same height, same build, same worn hiking jacket I'd seen 100 times before. He even smiled when his eyes landed on us, and for a brief moment the weight in my chest lifted. But then, the details started sinking in. His clothes were almost spotless, as if he hadn't been crawling through brush or sleeping on dirt. His boots didn't look like they'd touched mud, roots, or sharp rock. His skin was clean, too clean, without cuts, scratches, or the kind of grime that clings to you after days in the backcountry. 4 nights in the woods should have left him battered and filthy, but he looked like he'd just stepped out of a car at the trailhead. He didn't even look like someone who had been in the forest, let alone someone who had survived there for 4 days. At first, I thought maybe he'd stumbled across a cabin or a forest road, or maybe even been found sooner and cleaned up by the rangers before they brought him back. With time, I figured I'd be able to ask him more about what had really happened during those days. But as the day went on, that explanation made less and less sense. He wanted to keep hiking with us, as if nothing had happened. I started worrying that he was in some kind of shock, maybe showing signs of apathy. Or maybe he was just trying to block out whatever he'd been through. The calmness in him was unsettling, so steady it felt unnatural. We had to be firm and tell him there was no way we were staying another day. We were heading out, and he was going to a hospital. By then, I had convinced myself he must have hit his head out there, and that's why he was acting this way. During the hike back down the mountain with the rescue team, the rest of us tried to walk beside him, but it was clear something was very wrong. He didn't carry himself like someone exhausted or relieved to be safe. We were far more drained than he was, and we'd spent 4 days at the camp with fresh food and water. He moved steadily, almost too steadily, like every step was being calculated. He didn't ask what had happened while he was gone, showed no interest in food or water, and didn't display the kind of raw relief most people would after thinking they might die in the wilderness. When I tell you his behavior was absolutely bizarre, I'm not exaggerating. He acted like I would expect an automaton to behave at a science fair. Obviously, it wasn't just me who noticed. I caught Lisa glancing at me more than once with the same unease in her eyes. Hannah whispered later that his pupils looked strange, reacting slowly to changes in light. At one point, when he pushed up his sleeve, I remembered that Ryan had a faded scar across his forearm from a high school accident. It wasn't there. His skin was smooth, unmarked. I stared at him for long minutes, trying to convince myself that I must have mixed up his arms, that the scar was probably on the other one. But that's when I realized he was wearing a jacket. It was summer. We were all in tanks or t-shirts, comfortably warm. Yet he had his jacket on. Every time I looked at him, it was like I noticed something else that didn't quite add up. The more we descended, the heavier the atmosphere became. The rest of the rescue team was thrilled. They'd done their job, saved a life. But for us, walking beside the man we'd called our friend, something wasn't adding up. He gave vague answers to simple questions, as if he were repeating things he'd memorized rather than speaking from memory. His laugh, when it came, sounded empty. Like he knew when he was supposed to laugh, but didn't feel it. That night, we camped before finishing the trek out. The rangers were relaxed, joking around the fire. Ryan sat off to the side, staring at the flames without blinking for long stretches of time. He barely spoke, barely moved, just sat there, rigid and unblinking, like some automaton. Every time I looked at him, my gut twisted a little more. I can't stop thinking that if it happened now, the Rangers would have acted differently. Protocols are different. There's more caution. But back in 1995, they were just happy to have found a missing man. Eventually, I told him he needed to rest, and he gave a slight nod and flashed a fake smile. Then I went back to the tent. I couldn't stand watching that freak show any longer, and maybe a night of sleep would help me see everything more clearly in the morning. But I woke in the middle of the night to a scream that froze me in place. It was Hannah. I shot up, heart hammering, and saw Ryan dragging her out of her tent. His strength was unreal. Hannah wasn't small, maybe even stronger than him, but he moved her as if she weighed nothing. The sight was horrifying, and my mind couldn't process it at first. I scrambled out of my tent and ran toward them, screaming for the rescue team to help. They were already moving, alarmed, ready to act. But by the time I glanced back, Ryan was gone into the trees, and Hannah was collapsed on the ground, bleeding from her arm. She kept repeating over and over that he had bitten her. The wound was enormous, far larger than a human mouth could create. None of us could comprehend what had just happened. The rescue team immediately called for reinforcements, and within a couple of hours, a new team was combing the Smoky Mountains for Ryan. They searched relentlessly for 2 weeks, but there was no trace. After 2 years with no leads, his family officially declared him dead. The story released to the public was mundane and predictable. A man lost in the Smokies, like so many before and after him. I carried this story for years, unable to explain what I had seen. After that night, as I said, we all went our separate ways. I never told anyone the full details. But with the increase in disappearances in the Smokies, I can't stop thinking about what happened all those years ago. I have no idea if he's dead, or if he's still out there somewhere in the Smokies. I'll probably never know, because I'm never going back to those mountains. I'm gonna try to tell you everything that happened the best way I can. but fair warning. I'm not a great writer. So, if some things feel out of place, bear with me. First, a little background, so this makes sense. I've lived in West Virginia my whole life. And if you're used to hearing stories like this, you already know that name alone brings up all kinds of bad images. I'm not exaggerating when I say that. I work at a bar about 45 minutes from home. The bar's in a relatively busy area, busy for around here anyway. But my house is completely isolated. To get there, you take a long, mostly straight road with just 2 turns. That road's old, barely used anymore for 2 reasons. 1, there's always trouble on it, and old-timers swear it's cursed. 2, it's falling apart in places. I don't believe in curses, but I do know it attracts people with bad intentions. Back then, I took it every time. If I used the newer, safer road, it'd take me an hour and a half. And when you're getting off a night shift dead tired, that extra minutes feels like forever. Besides, I used to think if anyone ever tried something with me, I was more than ready to handle it. I was 23 when it happened, and that night was brutally hot. The bar has no AC, so it was a busy one. Drinks flying out as fast as we could pour them. And when people drink that much that fast, fights start easier. There was this group of 5 guys I'd seen plenty of times before. Something about them had always felt wrong. When they were just with each other, they were dead quiet and cold. But the second they moved into the crowd, especially around younger guys, they got loud, charming, funny. Working behind a bar long enough, you learn people's tells, and theirs gave me chills. That night, they felt different, like they were hunting for something or someone. I mentioned it to Joyce, the girl I worked with, and she told me they were always cold and calculated with her. That made me think hard, because Joyce is gorgeous and usually gets way more unwanted attention than I do. But these guys? They were overly friendly to me, always trying to get me to drink with them, making sure to touch my hand when I gave them change, locking eyes too long. Little things most people wouldn't notice, but I did. Then one of them straight up got into a fight with another guy at the bar. The stranger, a guy who looked to be in his early 20s, their exact type, was yelling that he'd been groped, and the guy from the group shouted back that he was crazy and just wanted attention. I knew exactly who was telling the truth, but most people there seemed to side with the group. I broke it up before it got more violent, and that's when I felt it. Their attention was locked on me. I knew in my gut I'd just become their target. When we closed up, I told Joyce that if I didn't call her within 2 hours to say I was home, she needed to call the cops. Around here, you don't throw the word police around unless it's serious. She agreed instantly, and looking back, that little precaution might have saved my life. We left in different directions. She headed into town. I headed for that empty, pitch-black road. I should have taken the longer way, but I told myself getting home faster meant getting safe faster. I know now how stupid that was, but at the time, I just wasn't thinking straight. About 10 minutes into the drive, through the stretch of forest, my headlights caught something move on the side of the road. I couldn't make out what it was, but my pulse spiked. As I kept driving, I couldn't shake the thought that I'd just seen a person standing there. A few minutes later, I was nearing the first turn I had to take when I saw it. A huge black bag lying right in the middle of the road. From the corner of my eye, it looked like it could have been a body. Luckily, my turn was to the left, so I swerved past it and kept going. But every nerve in my body was screaming that I was being hunted. By the time I reached the second intersection, I realized the bag hadn't been random. They weren't trying to make me stop. They were trying to make me turn where they wanted. The road to my house was blocked. There was another dark shape in the middle of it, and surrounding it were dozens of little metal glints. When my headlights hit it full on, I saw them. Nails. enough to shred my tires. The only other road there led to an old, abandoned area nobody used anymore. That was their plan. I knew in that moment that this had been their plan from the start, to keep me from going where I wanted and force me towards something they had prepared for me. I was literally being hunted. I was trapped, not knowing what to do, but then my body just acted. Pure, primal instinct, and a plan formed in my head. I threw the car in reverse, floored it, spun around, and headed back the way I came. They were on foot, at least for now, and I had a head start. I called Joyce, told her exactly where I'd be pulling off, and explained as fast as I could. She knew cops who'd take her seriously. Me calling 911 probably would have just gotten me brushed off. Once I had a plan, I killed my headlights and gunned it. When I hit the spot I wanted, I drove straight into the woods, hid the car as best I could, grabbed my gun, phone, and the emergency backpack I always kept in the trunk, and took off running toward an old abandoned farm I'd explored as a kid. I knew the layout, and I could hide there. The run through the woods was pure hell. Every snap of a branch made me think they were right there. I climbed through a broken window as quietly as I could and headed for the basement. The basement was by far the creepiest part of the whole house, and when I was a kid there had been countless stories about it. But at that point, I didn't care. Whatever was down there was preferable to being out there with those men. I sat in pitch-black silence for 2 hours before I heard a window break upstairs, followed by a man's voice yelling that it was the police. I didn't move. It wasn't the first time people had pretended to be figures of authority to lure in their prey. So I stayed hidden until I was absolutely sure it was really them. When I say it was the scariest night of my life, I'm not exaggerating. I never drove that road again. I never went back to that bar. Cops told me they found an abandoned house down the road those guys had tried to push me toward, but nothing else. A month later, I found 3 men in their 20s had gone missing in that area in the past year, and none of them were found. When I told police I thought it was connected to that group, they told me not to spread false information without proof, or I could be sued by the families. For 2 months, I lived in constant fear, knowing those men were still out there, and knew I'd escaped. I finally moved in with my parents in town, and a few months after that, I left for Denver. It's been years now, but I still hate driving through remote areas, especially at night. And I still have nightmares about that farm, that basement, and those men's faces. Just a small disclaimer before I begin. What I'm about to tell you did not happen to me, but to my grandfather, my favorite person in this world, though he sadly passed away last year. I have always loved to write, and I struggled terribly with keeping things brief, so forgive me if I linger on details. In truth, my grandfather was much the same, and the way I will recount his story is the way he once recounted it to me, partly because I want to honor him, and partly because some stories deserve to be told in full. My grandfather was not the kind of man who reveled in the telling of old tales or sought attention by conjuring up strange memories from his past. He carried himself with the steady composure of someone who had endured long hours of honest work and heavy silence, a man whose calm rarely faltered and whose words were rationed with a discipline born of hardship. He was detail-oriented, attentive to the little things, but above all, he was honest. When I was 16 years old, he told me something that has lodged itself in my mind like a splinter beneath the skin. A story so disquieting that, even now, I sometimes wish he had kept it buried with the rest of his secrets. He did not share it as a warning or with the cruel intention of frightening me. He shared it the way a weary soul finally surrenders a burden, letting fall the heavy stone that has pressed against his ribs for far too many years. It had happened in the mid-1970s, when he was a young man of 25, newly married to my grandmother, working grueling shifts at the coal-fired power plant that blackened the skies above the valley. On his rare days off, when the hum of the turbines still lingered in his ears and the weight of the machinery clung to his bones, he would disappear into the Appalachian hills. He was not a hunter, nor did he care much for fishing. He went into those ridges for solitude, for the deep silence between the trees, for the strange, almost spiritual relief he claimed he could only find where the mountain air thinned and the world fell away beneath him. One August morning, before the sun had burned off the mist, he set out with little more than a canvas pack slung over his shoulder, a battered thermos of black coffee, and the small notebook he carried to sketch crooked trees or scratch down thoughts he never meant anyone to read. The mountains were drowned in fog that morning, thick and pale, the kind that folds over the landscape until every shape is doubled and distorted. So the tree trunks leaned upon ghostly reflections of themselves, and the ridges blurred into shifting walls of gray. He followed an abandoned logging road, nearly swallowed by brambles and weeds, climbing higher than he usually dared. The earth damp beneath his boots, the silence disturbed only by the slow drip of water from unseen leaves. It was there, halfway along that overgrown trail, that he began to hear voices. He used to say he could hear the voices of the mountains, the murmur of the trees. But these were not the same kind of voices. These voices seemed human as he got closer. At first, it seemed no more than the echo of his own footsteps distorted in the hollow of the valleys, the way sound can bend and return strangely in the mountains. But the higher he climbed, the more deliberate the noise became. It was not conversation, nor the careless call of travelers. It was chanting, low, measured, relentless. The words themselves made no sense, harsh and broken syllables that resisted understanding, but together they rose and fell with the cadence of prayer. A ritual stripped of meaning, yet heavy with intent. He left the trail, slipping through tangled underbrush, each step a careful negotiation between roots and briars, until at last he reached a clearing no wider than a barn floor. There, in the dim wash of fog-filtered daylight, he saw them. A circle of figures, perhaps a dozen in all. Men and women together, their clothing drab and curiously outdated, as if borrowed from another century. Long skirts hanging heavy to the ankles, coarse work shirts, suspenders stretched taut over shoulders. Each one had a strip of dark cloth bound tightly across the eyes, obscuring their sight entirely. They stood motionless, save for the slow rhythm of their swaying bodies, surrounding a rough-hewn post driven into the soil at the clearing's center. And bound to that post, ropes cutting cruelly into his wrists and chest, was a man. My grandfather said the captive already looked half destroyed. His skin streaked with dirt, his shirt torn to ribbons, his face slack with exhaustion. A gag of soiled cloth was drawn tight across his mouth, though muffled cries forced their way through as he twisted desperately against the restraints. The blindfolded assembly encircling him chanted with greater intensity, their voices no longer separate, but braided together into one dreadful sound, as if the clearing itself had become the mouth of some unseen thing, speaking in tones that scalded the ear. Grandpa told me his body froze where he stood. His will was fierce enough to flee, but the ground seemed to anchor his legs, as though the soil itself refused to release him. At the same time, he couldn't leave that man there. He knew exactly what was happening. He had never seen it with his own eyes, but he knew there were cults in that area, And when he was a kid, he'd heard stories circulating through the village about children being kidnapped to be sacrificed. One of his childhood friends had disappeared, and no one ever found out what happened to him. That's why he didn't want to leave the man there, but he also knew he would suffer the same fate if he stayed or tried to interfere. The people in the circle swayed in unison, their palms raised faintly outward, faces tilted toward nothing, and still the chanting grew. Then, one among them broke the ring, stepping forward into the open space before the bound man. In that shifting light, my grandfather thought at first the figure carried a walking stick. But when the fog thinned just enough for a gleam to betray its shape, he saw the truth. A crude spear, its shaft whittled wood, its tip a shard of metal lashed firmly in place, sharpened to a deadly edge. The captive thrashed violently, gagged screams rising in panic. But the circle answered with a frenzy of sound, voices climbing together until they scraped against the air. My grandfather knew then, with absolute certainty, that should he betray his presence by the crack of a branch or the rustle of a leaf, they would find him. And if they found him, blindfolded though they were, he would not be spared. He had no weapon, no companion, nothing but a notebook, a thermos, and the frail hope that silence could carry him away unseen. He said that in that moment, every instinct to cry out, to intervene, to save the man bound to the post, was crushed beneath a heavier instinct, the instinct to survive. So, he retreated. Slowly, inch by inch, back into the concealing brush, each step placed with painful care, his heart battering against his ribs so violently he was certain they would hear it. The chanting masked all else, though, and when he had retreated far enough that the sound began to soften, he finally let himself turn. Then he ran. He ran without looking back. He told no one, not the sheriff, not the preacher, not even my grandmother. He bore it alone. The shame of having abandoned a man to his death was too much for him to bear, and he told me that if, at that moment, he had told anyone, everything he had lived through would have become reality, with no way to turn back. For years afterward, he said, each time he closed his eyes in darkness, he saw again the gagged man's face, distorted in anguish, ropes cutting into flesh, eyes wild with terror, above the cloth that silenced him. Yet worse than abandoning him, worse than the memory itself, was the gnawing certainty that those people, those blindfolded figures, were still there, hidden in those mountains, passing their secret sickness from parent to child, generation to generation, unseen in the folds of the ridges where few dared wander. When he confessed this to me decades later, his hands knotted restlessly together, his voice breaking with the weight of it. He did not embellish, did not perform. He just confessed. He died only a few years after that, and though I will never know whether the memory was exact in every detail, I do not doubt him. For when he spoke of the chanting, when he whispered that sometimes, even in dreams, he could still hear its rhythm climbing into frenzy, his voice carried a terror that could not have been invented. And now, whenever I find myself driving the back roads that wind through the Appalachians, when the trees press too close and the fog sinks low across the hollows, I think of him.